Welcome to Sarder TV, an idea-sharing platform founded by Russell Sarder, who's an author, investor, and the CEO of Netcom Learning. We're excited to have Ty Wiggins join us today. Ty advises leading companies on leadership transitions and onboarding, and is only a handful of people globally with a PhD in senior leadership transitions. And we're here to talk about his new book, The New CEO, Lessons from CEOs on How to Start Well and Perform Quickly, minus the common mistakes. Ty, it's great to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So tell us a little bit about yourself and your career journey and how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, so you can probably hear from my accent that I'm Australian. I'm based in our London office at the moment. I actually started my work career coaching basketball straight out of university, then moved into recruitment and finance, ran a small organization where I had the opportunity to coach a lot of business owners. That sparked that interest in business and leadership coaching. Had my own firm for a number of years with a business partner, and then I joined Russell Reynolds in 2019 at the completion of my PhD in leadership transitions, and I now lead our CEO and executive transition practice.
Great. And so what inspires you to write your new book, The New CEO?
I have a really privileged role. You know, I get to support CEOs and senior leaders as they enter into new roles, and it's sort of, I refer to it as a backstage pass. I get to see the good, the bad, and the ugly of the transition. And, you know, I get a really good understanding of how challenging it is to become the new CEO. So I was always interested in committing some of those thoughts to writing. I had some great stories to tell, and also recognize that whilst there's a lot of books that talk about transition generally, I didn't really find any that focused on the CEO role. So I wanted to make that a contribution to the literature.
Yeah, that's great. Give us a little bit of an overview of the book. What are some of the key themes and some insights readers can expect to gain from the book?
Well, feedback at the moment is that people are really enjoying, you know, how human the book makes the CEO and the CEO journey. So things that we really understand is that the CEO role is like no other. So as prepared as you think you're going to be, you're never really ready to be CEO. So challenges that come around loneliness, the scope of the responsibility and the accountability, the psychological challenges that come with leading an organization. You know, a lot of people talk about the responsibility as both a real positive and a negative. And, you know, what are the things that CEOs should be doing early and what should they be avoiding early on in their tenure in order to have a good start? You know, we make first impressions very quickly. There's a lot of pressure and attention on new leaders, especially CEOs, when they join. So there's a number of key themes that, you know, some of the CEOs have been able to share with us. And, you know, we're benefited by a good amount of research underneath. So I interviewed 35 CEOs globally, plus I interviewed a handful of well-known CEOs and added in the experience that I've had supporting CEOs over the last 10, 12 years.
Mm-hmm. And in your research and interviews that you did with CEOs, what were some of the most common mistakes you found new CEOs make during their transition into the role?
The common mistakes are really around early actions or comments that set the scene in a way the CEO doesn't really want it to be set. So when you start in the role, you need to be so attentive to what you say and what you do. And, you know, when CEOs have struggled, it's been because they've sort of got out of the gates a little bit too fast and said something that the organization's gone and run with. So there's a number of challenges with being CEO, and one is the attention that you get. And it is a real shock for a lot of people. Everything that you say is scrutinized. And, you know, one of the CEOs I interviewed, or ex-CEO, was Ron Williams from Aetna. And he had this great saying that a CEO's casual utterances can become a concrete building. And when you get groups of CEOs together, this is what they talk about. They tell stories about, I said this, you know, just I was thinking out loud, and all of a sudden there was 20 people working on this as a task force. So that level of attention is very different to what people experience. So this is one of the things where either their attitude, their demeanor, their pace around the office, their facial expression, I think they said, can set the organization off. And then what they find themselves doing is trying to unwind or pull that back. So when people ask me, what is the one mistake I shouldn't make? There isn't a particular mistake, but any mistake where you start to lose the confidence of the board is an important mistake.
Mm. So how does your book offer guidance on avoiding some of these pitfalls?
Through great stories. The CEOs that I was able to interview that are named in the book will be well known to many in the business community. These are successful CEOs, a combination of individuals that were promoted internally and also recruited from outside, plus the stories from the research. So from that, able to construct a model, essentially, some guidelines, if you would, in terms of what is important in terms of the priorities of a new CEO, and then what is important in terms of the approach that they take, and what are the factors that will really influence your transition. So I talk a lot about, the state of the business. This is one of the things that has a big bearing on how fast and what you do when you're a new CEO, same as whether you're internal or external. And importantly, what happens with the former CEO is one of those key factors that I found was really determining in terms of what you do and what you don't do. So with those priorities, what I'm trying to do is give CEOs a bit of a playbook in order to look at the key things that they should be looking at in terms of transition success. So remembering the goal of the book is to help people get going and get started well so that they have the time to deliver and prove that they're, prove what they can do in the role.
And the CEOs you interviewed in the book were between 12 and 18 months in their role. Why is this an important time frame?
So for the research underneath, the 35 people that I interviewed, I really wanted them to be post their first 12 months, but not too far post, so that the experiences were very real and very close. And it's at that point when they're at a high level of reflection. So I was very keen to understand what was sitting at the top of their mind in terms of, what they did, what were their priorities, how they prepared, what challenges did they have in terms of team and with the board, and the important question of if you had this transition again, would you do anything differently? And so we got some really good responses to that. With the CEOs that are named in the book, they were more tenured, and that was important because they had a different perspective in that they'd been in role 4 to 5, maybe 6 years, and had the benefit of longer term reflection on, now I can reflect on what I've done in that period of time and how it's translated to success.
And you also mentioned that CEO turnover is at an all-time high. Your research has shown this. What are some of the trends you're seeing?
We're definitely seeing shorter tenures of CEOs, which I think plays into the need to have a good start. It's come down, I think it's in the order of 2 years in tenure between 2018 and now. One of the things that we do as a firm every quarter is we look at the CEO turnover index. So for Q1 this year, the turnover was increased. It was up to about 15% of CEOs were turning over. And in that amount of CEOs, what we saw was 11% of the CEOs that turned over had only been in role less than 24 months. So we're starting to see a 10% sort of rate of CEO failed appointments within those first 2 years. But what was really upsetting and disappointing was we saw that for women CEOs, they were 2.4 times more likely to leave a role within the first 24 months. So this talks a lot to the glass cliff that we discuss, in business communities, and are we setting women CEOs up for success, or are we setting them up to fail? So we're seeing this trend. And I think part of this is the pressure economically, globally, is pushing boards to make quicker decisions. And if you're a new CEO, you have this first year period where you get to set yourself up, set the organization up. There's a lot of things that people expect you to do. It's in the second year that you really start to demonstrate the success of what you've decided to do. So this is where we're going to see a lot of this turnover. And certainly, there's a view that being CEO is a role that gets increasingly harder sort of every year. So if we think back 20 years ago, there are aspects that were still difficult, but there are different aspects now, which I think makes it an even harder role to occupy and succeed at.
What are some of those factors you think that might make it a little harder now than it did 20 years ago, or some of the different factors that might be contributing to that?
I think, we have a speed of development and information. AI is a classic example of, 5 years ago, it was sort of on the radar, but now it's every CEO's sort of top topic. Who in your organization owns that? Do they report into you? How much do you understand? How important is that longer term? One of the things I talk about in the book, which I think makes the CEO role tougher, is social media and the expectation that CEOs will have a view on any manner of socio-economic issues globally. And if they don't have a view, what does that say? If they have the wrong view, if they say something too quickly, too late. So if you take the constant pressure of being CEO in the organization, everyone watching everything that you do, and then you add to that the constant filming and pressure externally, it changes the role to one that is incredibly public. So this is not necessarily everyone's skill set nor everyone's comfort zone.
So start off by answering the question of the first chapter in your book, which is, why are CEO transitions so hard?
CEO transitions, of all the transitions, I think are the toughest. And any transition takes normally a high-performing individual into a situation where they're not starting from fresh, but a lot of what they were doing is now changing. So we get promoted and selected for roles because we're doing well. And there's a lot of aspects to doing well. When you go from an executive role into the CEO role, not only are you going through a significant transition, but like I said before, you're transitioning into a role that is very different. And this, Ramon LaGuardia is a great example of this. He was promoted internally in PepsiCo after being in the organization 25 years plus at very senior levels. And he said, I thought I knew what it was going to be like, and I didn't. When I got up there, it was a very different role. So my mental preparation is now, part of it's applicable, part of it's not. And he described it as needing to optimize a set of variables you've never encountered before. So we've got difficult transition. We know leadership transitions are tough. They often come up very high in the lists of stressful events behind sort of health. The onset of health issues and divorce is transitions. So we know it's difficult. You're now transitioning into a role which you thought you understood, but you don't. And you are the main attraction in the organization. Everybody is watching everything that you do. And depending on the state of the business that you've moved into, you could be moving with an organization that's performing, in which case you're finding your feet, you're finding your way, you're adapting, the strategy and process to your style of leadership. Or you could be stepping into an organization which is in a turnaround and, proverbially on fire and needing to make some really quick decisions with limited information. And all of that responsibility, as they say, the buck stops with you.
And there's a saying that it's lonely at the top, and your research confirms that being CEO can be lonely. Can you elaborate on this?
Yeah, I think this is one of the things that people are, conceptually, we understand it, but once you experience it, it's very different. Carol Tomei, who came off the board of UPS to become CEO, she was very candid. She said, people kept telling me this, and I go, really, how lonely is it going to be? I mean, I'm the CEO of a 500,000 person organization. The last thing I'm going to be is lonely. And then when she got into the role, she was saying, it really is. I used to be part of the executive team in her former role. Now what happens is they wait for me to leave the room so they can debrief and have the collegiate discussions that they have, and I'm out. So that aspect, and her comment was, it's just a reality, you need to get used to it. But the downside of it is that, and there's another CEO that talked about, even though he trusts his team explicitly, at any point there's 30 or 40% of things that are on his mind that he can't share. So this loneliness in terms of, the intellectual loneliness, in terms of candor, you have to be so careful. You can't just share how you're feeling. The risk is that you become quite isolated and that you feel this pressure that the decisions need to be yours or that there's things that you can't share. So one of the solutions for this is becoming a CEO. You need to have other CEOs in your network. If you've moved from the CFO role or from the CMO role, you probably have a great network of other CFOs and CMOs. Becoming CEO, you need a network of other CEOs so that you can share what it feels like and have these type of discussions. Also, the use of outside advisors, coaches, and mentors will help with this. But the loneliness is a real thing for CEOs.
What perspective have CEOs provided on the best and the worst parts of the job?
I love this question. This is the last question I ask when I do the research, which is ongoing. And quite often it's the same answer, and it's the responsibility. So lots of people talk about being CEO. Very few get the opportunity to be CEO. And for some people, it's a really good decision not to take that role. But for the people that get to that level and get to that role, what attracts them is the responsibility of taking the organization forward, of making some of those decisions that will leave the organization in a better state in the future, and will, deliver the outcomes for the employees, for the customers, for the communities, for the shareholders, etc. So it's a responsibility that attracts them to it. It's also the responsibility that weighs really heavily. When they start to think about, I've got, in Carol's case, 500,000 employees, which is 500,000 families, plus the suppliers, the customers, the importance of what they're moving around. You can't sort of put this down, and this is how they describe it. It's a weight you can never put down. So that is the bit that really weighs heavily on them. And again, it's one of those things that conceptually going in, they say, yes, I know. But when it sits on them, they go, okay, it's quite a lot.
Can you share some strategies or best practices you've identified that enable new CEOs to sort of hit the ground running and really make that positive impact early on in their tenure?
Absolutely. So, communication really early is very important. We have a lot of, high performing executives becoming CEO, and they have a real bias to action. And yes, they want to get in and make some changes and make some improvements. But day one, or even T minus 10, the way you communicate and what you say is almost as important as what you do. So having clear communication early around a theme to your transition, that you're excited to be here, you're enthusiastic, this is a complex organization, you're here to learn, you're here to serve. These type of things can really engender you to the organization, because one of the concerns the organization has is new CEO represents a lot of change. But the other aspect is that sometimes people fear that the CEO comes in and she's already made her mind up about everything that she wants to do and she's not going to listen. So there's this sort of animosity straight away. So starting with a clear theme, not trying to boil the ocean too early in terms of what you're going to do. And again, the caveat here is if you're in a turnaround situation, you have less time to get the information. So you have to be really comfortable to make decisions with limited information and limited context. But early on, setting up, clear communication is really important. One of the things that I see differently between first-time CEOs and second and third-time CEOs is in those initial months, the experienced CEOs will spend more time with the people in the organization and less time, say, on the financials or the operating model or the explicit bits of information that are around. Because they know that in order to do well or to make changes or to drive the organization, what they really need to understand is both the enabler and the blocker is trapped in the individuals. So they spend this disproportionate amount of time out meeting people, talking to people, asking really good questions, taking information, feeding back what they're hearing in a way that's non-confrontational. So I talk about using language like what I'm hearing, what people are telling me, what I'm learning, as a great way to sort of trial your ideas without writing them in stone. So experienced CEOs will do a lot of this early, and then they get to a point where they can speak really confidently about what is going on in the organization. And when people hear them repeating that, they trust them. And so if you're a CEO and you need the organization to move, you need to establish trust pretty quickly.
And for those who are transitioning, can you explain why the CEO transition is different from other executive positions?
It's really around those variables that Ramon Laguarta mentioned. There are lots of aspects to the CEO role that only the CEO encounters. Things like dealing with the board. A lot of executives will have really good exposure to the board. They will have presented to the board. They will have met the directors. That's one aspect of the board. It's very different once you're actually in the CEO role and you're reporting to the board. So you think about reporting to an individual versus reporting to 5, 7, 10, 12 individuals. That's one aspect. Dealing with the street or the market is another aspect, which is, unless you're the CIO or the CFO, it can be really, really challenging to do that. So that's another aspect that you really need to experience. So you're learning this as you're running the organization and you're learning things. Another aspect, which is quite challenging for some individuals, is what I call functional bias. So if you, and I'm not picking on the CFOs, but if you're a CFO and you've come through finance, you've no doubt run and even built high-performing teams of very like-minded individuals. It's very different when you become CEO to be engaging and leading a team that has a finance professional, a marketing professional, a HR professional, a technology professional. This is a very different team to be leading. And this team needs to be ultra high performing for you to be successful. So that's another aspect that can really challenge individuals. I worked with one who had been the COO after being the CFO. And he said, I spent the last 5 years sort of harassing marketing around their returns on investment and resource allocation and competing with them. And then I was CEO and now I'm responsible for their success. And he said it took him about 18 months to get to a point where he felt he was actually in a position to contribute as CEO to the marketing function. So that's an example of one of the adjustments that CEO didn't, foresee.
Mm-hmm. And I know you mentioned, you talk about that in your book, and you outline these tips for CEOs, starting with, checking your biases at the door. Can you just elaborate a little bit more on that?
I mean, we all have biases. It's one of our ongoing areas of development. And there are a number of biases that turn up when people go through a transition, and I also see with CEOs. And the most common one is confirmation bias. So when you accept the role, you've already started to form decisions and have thoughts about the organization, and you're making assumptions. And so you go in sort of not fresh in terms of your thinking. You go in already biased. And then there's another aspect of it, which is a little bit more sort of negative, which is it's a challenging time for you to transition into a new role, especially as CEO. So there will be moments where your confidence might get knocked. So one of the things that makes you feel really positive is finding something that you expected to find. I think that the CRM system is terrible, and lo and behold, here it is, it's terrible. So your confirmation bias can be almost in overdrive as you move around the organization, trying to find things that make you feel confident that you're up to the challenge, that the board selected the right individual, that you can actually do this. And so the adage of, inspect what you expect is really valuable. So oftentimes I'm working with clients and they come forward with something that they're very happy to have found. And I sort of say, well, if you remember 2 months before you raised that you thought you might find this. So how do we challenge that this is actually what you found? There's another bias around the availability bias, which talks about, how commonly you hear things. The more available the information is, the more you trust it. So if you do a small amount of sort of listening to us and people tell you the same thing, you can latch onto that very quickly. So one of the challenges is, how do you stay as unbiased and as objective and open as you can in those early stages? Because once the information flow gets constricted and people start feeding you what they think you want to know, your decision making will get impaired.
Mm-hmm. So what are some tips to make sure that doesn't happen?
I think having an idea of those expectations going in and having them committed. Again, the work that I do, I'm asking questions. So tell me about the team. What do you know? How do you know it? Who told you that? Where did you read that? How are we getting this information? So I'm really putting to the test the assumptions and the information they're going in with, and then challenging their findings as they come through. So this is where, being CEO, it's really important to have people around you that will challenge you and tell you that they think you've missed something, or that you've misunderstood it, or that you might just be flat out wrong. Because once you become CEO, as the joke goes, your jokes are funnier, your stories are more interesting, people are there for you. There's lots of people smiling and nodding at you. But who's really telling you, hey, Ty, I think you're way off base here. So if you go into a role without anybody around you that's going to really challenge you, you're going to hear a lot of what you want to hear, and it's going to feel great. Challenge is 6 months down the track, you might find that it's not actually correct.
And so, talking about teams, you discussed the importance of building and leading effective teams as a CEO. Can you share some examples or case studies from your research that highlight successful team building strategies employed by new CEOs?
So the senior leadership team is the biggest regret people have when they talk about what would they do differently. It's most commonly, I would move quicker on the team. So we know that to be CEO, you need an effective team. This is not a one-person job. You can't do this on your own. And one of your key levers for success is an effective senior leadership team. So the sooner that you put this in place, the better. And the reality is that getting a senior leadership team set and performing will take most CEOs upwards to a year to do that. So now we're looking at one of the key levers for your ability to deliver on the promises that you've made the organization is going to take you a whole year to get ready. So you need to move on this quickly. And some of the strategies really early on is, obviously spending quality time with them individually and as a group. So what you'll see some CEOs do is they'll increase the cadence of the senior leadership team meeting. If it's fortnightly or even longer, they'll bring that to weekly. I want to see everyone together every week. They'll use offsites. And a good tip around doing an offsite early is for the CEO not to facilitate it. You need to sit back and watch how people interplay, because what you're looking at as CEO is the individual capabilities and motivations, but you're also looking at the interplay for the individuals as a team. And you need to see them as quickly as you can, as often as you can. Next is you need to really trust your instincts around these individuals. The reason why people delay is they use a whole bunch of rationality and reasoning to providing people more grace, giving them a different chance, worst case thinking that they can fix them or make them better. But the reality is most of the CEOs I work with, they get a very good read very early. You need to trust that. You're a senior executive, you've got well-honed instincts around people. Changing out the senior leadership team as a CEO is not necessarily a reflection that those people are no good. It's often a reflection that for the way that I want to lead and for the organization that I want to build, this is not the right person for my team. So getting in to make those changes as soon as you are sure and comfortable is really, really important.
And you mentioned,
the only other thing would be the use of assessments for data. So Hans Vestberg, when he went into Ericsson as CEO and also in Verizon, ran, I think, the top 200 people through an independent assessment process. And he did that because he wanted to remove any of the organizational bias. He wanted to challenge his own biases. And he wanted to find out, really where the strengths lie in the organization and the top leadership. And what he found in that process, which was that in a lot of cases, he had the right people in the wrong roles. So he had great people, but through a whole variety of reasons had ended up in different roles. And by reorganizing that, he got a real lift in his leadership capability.
Great. So you mentioned that experienced CEOs often regret not moving fast enough on people decisions. What are some things that you learned on how new CEOs can effectively or have effectively built their senior leadership teams, delegate responsibilities, empower their teams?
One aspect where I see this working poorly is where the CEO doesn't accept the full gamut of the role. So sometimes CEOs who come from an executive team will step up into the CEO role and want to maintain the level of camaraderie and consensus and collaboration that as an executive team member, they thought, we're really good, we should be making these decisions. When they become CEO, they realize that they need to make the decisions. So if they resist that, it can cause some confusion in the team. And it means that they spend too much time seeking consensus, and that can slow them down. One aspect that is really prevalent at the moment and coming up in a lot of conversations is that the senior leadership team needs to be each other's first team. So when you ask the executive team who their team is, do they describe their peers on the executive team, or do they describe the team below them? So again, as the CMO, is my team the marketeers, or is it the CHRO, the CFO, the COO? Now, getting a team, an executive team, to think like this can be quite a shift. Another of the CEOs I interviewed, Winnie Park, does this really, really well. And she challenges her team from day one. Your team is the group around this table. So there's a big difference between the team that you are responsible for and the team you're accountable to. Now, if you're the CEO and you can get your executive team to think like this, what we're actually building is enterprise level thinking. So as the CTO, I have a really good understanding of how everything that I'm doing affects everyone else's division. And I'm not here just lobbying for headcount or for resources or for CapEx. I'm here to try and to help the CEO solve the enterprise problems with an enterprise mindset. This is a significant shift in terms of executive team performance, and you see a massive lift in the CEO's ability to drive change and improve performance when the executive team is actually the first team.
So the other thing that you also talk about with all of this is around time and energy management and how important it is for new CEOs to prioritize their time and their energy, especially when they're balancing all these different responsibilities between the board and the external stakeholders and managing the company. What strategies do you have for CEOs to help with this?
There is no shortage of things to do and people to meet and responses to deal with when you're CEO. When you talk to CEOs about how they manage this in their early days, a lot of them, in hindsight, will talk about being quite deliberate and discerning about what they accept. You suddenly get all these invites to speak at conferences and interviews and so forth, and this can be quite a distraction, being a new CEO. So you need to be really clear about how you're going to prioritize your time and also your energy. So one of the things I talk to CEOs about is that a CEO can give her time, but not her energy. But if she wants things to move through, she has to put the energy to it. So I can turn up and sit there, but if I'm actually a driving force, that's a difference. And you have a very limited supply of time and of energy. So spending that wisely and being really clear about the areas where you have a unique contribution as CEO is really, really important. One of the things that we looked at through the research was how much time is spent with the board in the first year. And it came out at an average of 25%. So this is a significant impact. When CEOs are preparing for the transition, it's unusual for them to be allowing for a day and a half of the week will go to board and board-related activities. So this is one of those aspects around making sure there's some capacity around what you're doing. When boards sort of complain to me early that they're worried about their new CEO, it's usually for two reasons. And one of the reasons that they point out is that the CEO's calendar is so jam-packed that they wonder when this individual has time to think about the business. So as CEO, some of the things that only you can do is really think about the business longer term. You're looking down 3, 5, 10 years. You're the only person in the organization doing this. So the board comes to me and says, listen, her calendar is so jam-packed. When is she thinking strategically about the business? So you often hear boards talk about, we'd like to see 10 to 15% of your calendar empty for redundancy, for access to people that they need, but also for time for you to think about the business. So it's a real challenge, and having a really good support in terms of personal support, professional support, office of CEO, how do these people help you in terms of what you need to do and what you don't need to do is really, really valuable early on.
Mhm. You also discussed the importance of listening and owning one's narrative, your own narrative as a CEO. How can new CEOs really navigate this balance between listening to stakeholders while driving the organization forward with their vision?
Again, so signposting the time of learning and listening and giving credibility to the fact that the organization takes time to learn. Every organization has this period of time. If you ask people, how long does it take to learn the organization you're in? You get this variety of 6 months, 12 months, 18 months. So acknowledging that early can help other people in the organization. Owning the narrative is really important. I use another adage in the book, which is, we judge ourselves by our intent, others judge us by our behavior. So for a new CEO or any new leader, you need to be very overt with your intent. I'm changing this meeting cadence because, I'm changing this reporting structure because, I'm doing this because of these reasons. Because if you don't outline your intent, others will guess it. And if they guess it incorrectly, it can be quite difficult. So remember, as CEO, before you've started, numerous stories about you have flown around the organization. Everyone that thinks they know someone who knows you is talking about something that you've done. So you have a perception before you've started. If you leave that as is and it's not correct, it can make it challenging in the way you communicate and deliver what you want to do for the organization. So this area of communication is so important. You need to make sure people are clear about your intent. You need to make sure that when you're asking questions, that you're retelling to the organization what you're learning and what you're hearing. And you need to be very careful with your language in terms of shifting from present tense to past tense, because consciously and subconsciously, we hear that you've made your mind up. And again, one of the key challenges for CEOs is, and I describe it as you'll see more, but you'll hear less. So to be effective as a CEO, you need to make the best possible decisions that you can make. This is why CEOs are, so important, is because their decisions have such an effect on the organization. To make those decisions, you need to have the best information. Now, you play a huge role in how much information comes to you. We talk a lot about, you see these funny sort of things that come around on LinkedIn, where people talk about, the leader comes in and says, here's the problem, here's what I think we should do, but I'm really interested in your view. And of course, they've shut down the conversation before they've started it. So you've restricted the flow of information. And if you do that, it's just going to jeopardize your ability to make really, really good decisions. So, this aspect around the narrative of why you're here, what you're doing, what's important to you, and what you're planning to do and by when is crucial early on.
And does this narrative kind of help them manage their personal brand and their reputation within the organization and externally? What are some of those things that they should be doing to do that?
I think understanding what their personal brand is from other people's perception is really important. Like I said, trying to understand what are people talking about when they talk about me before I've even started. So this bit is quite important. Talking about their preferences as a leader. We all have things that are really important to us. There's non-negotiables. And these are things that you need to explain and explain in a way that's beneficial. A lot of leaders will talk about transparency, but saying I believe in transparency is one thing. Explaining what transparency means and the benefit that it drives to the organization is another. So it's not enough just to say the first bit. You need to actually make sure that you're communicating why that's important and what's important to you. One of the aspects, again, that I see often differently between first time and second and third time CEOs is this concept of the first time CEO is still trying to work out what type of CEO they are. They have a firm view and it often moves because, again, once they get into a role, they realize there's a whole bunch of stuff in front. When I work with second, third, fourth time CEOs, when they approach the organization, what they're saying is, what type of leader, what type of CEO does this organization need me to be right now? And so they're more flexible in their style. So their brand shifts. And this is where you see, a real push around servant leadership and the humility of the CEO, that it's not about me, it's about you. It's not about what I want, it's about what we need. I can make the tough decisions, but I'm making it in concert with what the organization needs. So it's a big responsibility to be CEO. And this, I have one way of doing stuff and everyone needs to work with that one way. It's not very applicable anymore.
So then in today's business landscape where things are just evolving and changing so quickly, what do you think are some of the most essential qualities or skills that new CEOs need to cultivate and thrive in their roles?
So in addition to the skills like communication, the other interpersonal skills in terms of presence, listening, CEOs that have a really strong learning mindset, have a high degree of humility, I think is crucial, because you are going to be put in situations on a regular basis where you are not prepared. There's information that you weren't aware of. You need to be flexible. You need to be comfortable to tell the organization the things that you know and the things that you don't know. You need to be comfortable to ask for help and to put that in place. I think that the humility is probably the key part of it. Mark Bitzer from Whirlpool, he had this great approach to the fact that he just sort of had to keep reminding himself, even though the business felt like his, he kept saying to himself, I'm just a salaried employee and the business will be here long after I'm here. In fact, that's my job. Other people will occupy this seat as CEO, and other people have. And I need to make sure that I stay really focused on the fact that I have a role to play, and it's to the benefit of the organization and everyone that belongs to it. And that's really, really important. So I think those are aspects. And then there's, the ability to work with ambiguity and complexity are pretty standard, but to be able to do so with pace. And again, I reflect on the AI discussion. I would expect that the AI is keeping CEOs up at night. This thing is moving quickly. They need to be on top of it. It's not an area that they understand. So your ability to do that and to adjust and to learn, I think, is really important.
So finally, just based on your research and your experience, what advice would you give to aspiring CEOs who are preparing to transition into their first role as CEO? And I also want to ask you, what advice would you give to those who are aspiring to the CEO role?
So if I do the second one first, if you're aspiring to the CEO role, I would be thinking about the concepts of enterprise thinking, functional bias, understanding that to be really effective as a senior executive, you need to have a broad understanding. We sometimes talk about it as a narrow or a wide T, with the vertical being your expertise, the horizontal being your ability to understand the broader business. So put yourself in situations where you have to understand the other functions. Put yourself in meetings and again, sort of task force and teams where you can be involved in that. The broader that enterprise level thinking, I think the higher up on the list you appear for boards around the succession and selection process, because this is what they're going to need. I think if you're about to become CEO, there'd be a couple of things. Prepare, do your due diligence, do your preparation. Planning your transition is very valuable. Think about the key themes. Be ready to expect or to understand that you won't be ready. So don't let that shock you. That's a very normal thing. And I think as you prepare to step into the role, think about who will support you. Who will tell you the truth, who will give you good advice, who can operate as a mentor, and be really clear when you start on what you are going to talk about and what you're going to say and what you're going to wait about. I'd say that would be really, really key.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Ty. This was really interesting and really provided some great insights and strategies for new CEOs who are transitioning, and even for those who are just interested in what it's like for the CEO role. So thank you so much.
No, thank you for having me. It was great.
And we'll see you next time on Sarder TV.